Bé, doncs bona tarda, benvinguts avui en aquesta conferència, que estem molt i molt contents de poder tenir aquí a Peter McMahon, de la mà de Josep Maria Virolés, una conferència que ha sigut pràcticament una sorpresa, no? I sobretot estem molt contents que s'hagin pogut realitzar aquestes connexions entre aquests dos espais, no? Aquest Cot per una banda i Cadaqués per l'altra, no? Ara en Peter McMahon ens explicava que ha estat visquent justament uns quants dies a Cadaqués, descobrint l'arquitectura que també des d'aquí s'ha preservat i s'ha recuperat d'una manera molt similar al que ha passat al Cape Cod, no? De fet, el Peter és el president de la fundació del Cape Cod Modern. Ells han fet una feina molt interessant de recuperar un tipus d'arquitectura moderna que per sort formava part d'un parc natural, que ha fet possible aquesta preservació i ells han aconseguit, diguem-ne, els recursos necessaris per poder recuperar i portar a la vida una altra vegada aquesta arquitectura, una arquitectura feta de la mà d'arquitectes i d'artistes, sobretot, on s'estableixen aquesta relació molt directa amb l'arquitectura també de Cadaqués. I res més, us passo la paraula a Josep Maria Virolés, que farà la presentació del conferenciant.
Sí, gràcies.
Et deixo...
Si em dones un pam.
I tant, tots.
Sí? Doncs canviem.
Canviem la cadira.
Gràcies. Molt breument, per explicar que aquesta conferència és un fet relativament casual. El Peter McMahon, en la seva recerca, visita Barcelona, Cadaqués, passa per Girona, per casualitat tenim uns amics comuns i ofereix, podria fer una conferència a Girona sobre les meves recerques, sobre la tasca que fa a Cape Cod amb el Trust de l'arquitectura moderna de Cape Cod i aquelles connexions de persones i actituds que ha trobat potser una mica més remotes, als anys 30 fins als 50 a Cape Cod, potser uns 15-20 anys més recents a Cadaqués. En tot cas, aquest assumpte semblava de prou interès com per proposar-ho al col·legi, que generosament acull una activitat relativament improvisada. Us asseguro que la qüestió té gràcia i té interès. Les arquitectures que estan en restauració a les seves mans, les 4 peces que han restaurat de propietat pública en el Parc Nacional i la d'en Marcel Breuer, que estan ara fent els plans necessaris per intentar restaurar-la, són peces de primer ordre i que ens porten, diguem-ne, en moments molt il·luminats i molt brillants, diguem-ne, de la creació artística i del pensament d'aquells anys finals dels 30, etc. La tasca d'ells té interès. Vull remarcar, i aquí acabaré, li dono la paraula perquè tingui temps de parlar ell, que és en definitiva el que té interès, que en Peter ha tingut la generositat de regalar-nos aquest llibre a la nostra biblioteca i que ja està aquí. És un llibre fantàstic que estarà a la nostra biblioteca. És un llibre de tota manera que es pot comprar, qui el volgués. L'ha escrit juntament amb la Cristina Cipriani i repassa aquesta arquitectura de mitjans del segle XX a Cape Cod. No només l'arquitectura, sinó també els pensaments, els personatges, etc. Per tant, moltes gràcies per aquest llibre que, en tot cas, el donaràs a qui porta el col·legi, no a mi, que sóc un personatge casual.
Doncs moltes gràcies. Thank you very much. Bueno, fem la foto, no?
I have to give it to you.
Thank you. Moltes gràcies.
Un llibre fantàstic que val la pena, els que no el vulgueu comprar, mirar-lo a la biblioteca. Per favor, Peter,
molt bé.
Go ahead.
Ja que estem aquí, nosaltres li oferim també unes publicacions aquí del col·legi, al Peter, que inclouen la guia que vas preparar en anglès sobre la guia de Girona. Hi ha unes quantes publicacions més que tenim aquí, que com a mínim es puguin portar un record del col·legi que és Girona. For you.
Thank you.
Okay?
Beautiful.
It's our revenge.
Yes.
Thank you.
Molt bé.
Per tant, sisplau, comencem. Please go ahead.
In the US we call this swag. When you go to an award show, they give you a bag. It's called swag. Which is
Okay.
okay, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for Jose Maria inviting me and the Colegio on very short notice. I know it's not a good time of the year, for things like this, but I appreciate doing this on short notice. Do we want to turn the lights a little bit, or? Gracias. Si tengo un poco de español, so por no entienden, quizás puedo explicar. Hace un movimiento. And I will try to talk slowly. So Cape Cod, Cabo de Bacalao, I call it, off of Massachusetts near Boston. Has anybody ever been there? No? Okay. So 20,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, a glacier came down from Canada, pushing dirt and sand and rocks. And when that glacier retreated, it dumped all this sand. And really, this is 20,000 years old, so it's a new piece of topography. And where I'm going to be talking about is Wellfleet, which is here, and then mostly over here on the ocean, and then this is Truro, and this is Provincetown. And I was just saying that Provincetown is a Portuguese fishing town, so the Portuguese came from the Azores, and it's still very Portuguese, and people still speak Portuguese, a lot of them. So there's another connection. So around 10,000 years ago, the indigenous people occupied the Cape. They're called the Wampanoag tribe, and they are still there, although they were very, persecuted and oppressed. They are still there, and their houses, the Wampanoag house is called a witu. So it's made from bent trees, and then a light skin of tree bark and of mat. So I show this partly because this is a theme that reoccurs, which is this light frame with a skin, and then the building is flexible. You can move it, you can take the skin off. Often in the winter they would move into the woods. So in the summer they would move down to the ocean, and they would leave the frame there, but they would take the skin. So another thing about Cape Cod is the land is always moving. So the wind, the sea, nothing is permanent. Everything is moving. So often you have to move things. The Europeans came and cut down all the trees. So there were no trees. And in a lot of pictures, even until the 1950s, you see there's no trees. So wood became very, very valuable, and there were a lot of shipwrecks. So that when there was a shipwreck, the town would go out and take the ship apart. And in an old house, you will very often find pieces of old ships. How are people understanding me? Okay. Yeah, okay. Also, a lot of houses were moved. So this is a house that was in Provincetown that was on the far point, and at some point they put it on a raft and floated it. They would also take a house apart completely and move it on the ice in the winter. This is called flaking a house, like you flake a fish. So you would take all the parts, and then you would number each one, and then you would put it back together. So this is the land mostly where I'll be talking about. This is one of the freshwater ponds, and this is the Atlantic on the right. This man, Jack Phillips, was from an old New England family. His great-grandfather was the first mayor of Boston, and these are sort of the people, the English who came over very early on the Mayflower. So he went to Harvard, and he graduated, and his uncle gave him 800 acres of land. So this is a very large piece of land. It had 7 freshwater ponds. It went from the ocean all the way to the road, and he had been to Paris and studied with Leger and Léaut, so he was an artist, and he had seen early modern architecture. And he was married 5 times and had a lot of children, and this is his wife Magouche, who was actually an amazing person. She ended up going back to Paris and died not very long ago. So he starts building these very inexpensive buildings, sometimes with wood that he finds that washes up on the beach. So he had all this land, but he didn't have any money. And he was a painter. So this was a painting studio, which later fell in the ocean because of erosion, right? And later on, this was used by a Spanish painter named Javier Gonzalez, who had an art school in Wellfleet, and he used this as a studio. So this is a painting by Gonzalez. And then right after World War II, he bought a train car filled with prefabricated army barracks for soldiers. And then he would put one of these prefab buildings wherever he thought was a good spot for a house. These are all still there, and some very famous people have lived in these. Charles Jenks, the godfather of postmodernism, actually grew up partly in Wellfleet. And this is him as a teenager in front of one of the prefabs. So it's funny because this dirt road that goes out there, you go down the road and you see these family name signs. So you go by Saarinen, Breuer, Chermayeff, and at the end of the road is Jenks. So it's like the history of 20th century architecture, you know. So in the Depression, in the late 1930s, there was a lot of empty buildings. So the fishing industry was very bad. The whaling industry was very bad. Actually, there were Basque also. And then Basque were very involved with the whaling industry. Have you seen Moby Dick, the movie? So this was right nearby. So New Bedford is right at the base of Cape Cod. So these artists and writers started coming to Wellfleet in the late 1930s. Wellfleet was already down to like 300 people because a lot of people left. And so you could buy a house like this for a few $100s, an old house, an old farmhouse. And, you know, there was a train that went right to New York City, so you could, you know, if you had a doctor's appointment, you could get on the train and go back to New York. And this was the house of a man named Lorenzo Dow Baker, and it was empty. And so a guy named Jack Hall bought it. He was an artist, and he basically turned it into a little farm. He had chickens and horses, and so these were kind of, this group, we called them the Brahmin Bohemians. They were bohemians, they were artists, they were also kind of proto-hippies. They were farming, they were, you know, they were living kind of self-supporting. So he would find these old barns and he would put them together. So he would buy an old barn and put it on his house, on his yard, and made it from. This was his Rolls Royce. Also, he had a Rolls Royce. So he did these interventions, and this is partly what is part of the connection with Herndon and Bombelli and what these guys were doing is they're doing these modernist interventions into old vernacular buildings. So this house is from 1720. Jack Hall bought it, and he put these big windows in there, and he made this sort of hybrid of antique and modern, and the furniture was the same, old furniture, modernist furniture, and they didn't see any contradiction. This was just kind of they liked old things, they liked modern things, they just put them together. His kind of most interesting building is the Hatch House, Jack Hall. He also none of these guys studied architecture. They were architecture enthusiasts, but they never studied it, so they were self-taught. And they were often self-taught builders as well, and self-taught painters, some of them. So they were just doing their own thing. So this is the Hatch House. This is it under construction. But I would say, again, you have this light frame, and then you have a skin that is hung on that frame. And there's this idea of flexibility and of impermanence. These are summer houses. They're not insulated. Just before, although he didn't go to architecture school, he worked for George Nelson, the great designer, and he actually worked on this project in Moscow that Charles and Ray Eames and a lot of Bertoya and Buckminster Fuller built a dome. So this was a show in Moscow that was showing American products and basically promoting American dishwashers and cars and clothing. And actually Nixon and Khrushchev had this argument here in front of the American kitchen, and they had this whole argument about whose kitchens were better, Russian or American kitchens. But this is also related to what Peter Herndon was doing. Peter Herndon was doing these sort of working for the State Department, promoting American culture, democracy, capitalism, probably the CIA too, yes. But if you look at the lower left, that's kind of the Hatch House there in a different scale and a different material. Also in his office, in George Nelson's office, there was this prefab aluminum house concept, which was never built, but he would have seen the model. So this is a factory-made house with these cubes that can be raised and lowered. It's an interior. So there are no studs. There's only the skin of the siding, and all of the structure is in the superstructure, the frame. So in 2006, I curated an exhibit in Provincetown at the museum on the modern architecture, and I had students make models, and I grew up in a modern house, so I knew about some of them, but nobody really had a picture of how many there were. There's over 200 modern houses on the Cape, and but it really wasn't. It was not uppermost in people's minds that it was that there was a real collection of important modern architecture. So as part of this show, I started talking to the national park. There's a national park, so half of Cape Cod is in a national park, and therefore protected. And in that process of creating the park, it was created by the Kennedys, by JFK's family. The park ended up owning some houses, quite a few houses, and some important modern houses. Their plan was to demolish them, and the Park Service is very slow, and they don't have much money, and so they never got around to demolishing them. So they just sat there and rotted. So the historian for the park basically said to me, when we went around, started going and looking at every house, and he said, you know, if there was a nonprofit we could deal with, you could lease the buildings and restore them and raise the money and figure out what to do with them. So that's why I started the trust in 2007, and we applied for our first lease, and so we have so far done 4. This is the Hatch House, which was the second house, and it had been empty for many years and was in bad shape. This is a plan, so it's cubes, and this is a very small house. So the interior is 600 square feet. What would that be in meters? 600. Anyway, this is 7 feet, so a little more than 2 meters, and there's the same number of squares of exterior. So this is a indoor-outdoor house, and the family built another cube about 10 years after, and they followed all the same rules. So this is a modular, you could say like a metabolist building. It grows as you need it to grow. This was a fantasy of the 60s, but this actually worked, you know. And also the house opens and closes, so there's these shutters. On the first time I saw this house, it was closed, and I didn't know it was a house. I couldn't figure out what it was. I thought it was a storage thing for a lobster fisherman, you know. And then when it's open, it's all amazing. This is during the reconstruction. We had to dig up all the footings and replace them. And this is afterwards. So we had to redo the deck, the wiring, the plumbing, the septic, the well. And this is the interior. This is the only house where we got the contents of the house. So the books, the art, the furniture, the kitchen equipment is all the Hatch families. So this is really great because Robert Hatch was the editor of The Nation magazine, and his wife Ruth was a painter. So we got all of the context of the interior in there. And this is our most popular house as far as renters. It's the smallest. It's the most rustic. It has no Wi-Fi. It has no nothing. There's no cell service. And people go crazy over this house. And you know. And in the distance is Provincetown, because the curve. This is on the bay side. There's a lot of George Nelson references in this house, and one of them is this deck, which looks like the George Nelson bench, you know. This is the third of the Bohemian Brahmins, Hayden Walling. He came to Wellfleet when he was 18 years old and bought some land from Jack Phillips and just started building a house. He was the child of important American socialists. His mother was Russian, Anna Strunsky, and his father was a millionaire socialist from Louisville, Kentucky. And they went to, there's a whole book about them, but they went to fight with the Bolsheviks and got arrested by the Tsar and put in prison and then released, and they met Tolstoy. And then they came to America and started the NAACP, which is the most important civil rights organization. So anyway, they were part of this milieu of the leftist intellectuals that were down there. So he started building this house when he was 18. He actually found old bricks that were out there and old locust beams, roof beams, and then this tower was a water tower from the town that they were going to demolish, and so he put it on a wagon and dragged it back there. So again, you have this combination of old and modern. And also, like in Cadaqués, the outside looks old and the inside looks modern, you know. This is the house of James Lachey, the painter, also by Hayden Walling. So Hayden Walling never studied architecture, but he became a very good builder. And he actually didn't draw. I mean, he would do like a little sketch on a napkin, and he would just kind of arrive and start building, you know. And so these were very provisional buildings, and he got to be a very good builder. And as I was saying earlier, these were very inexpensive buildings. So, you know, $3,000, $4,000, the whole project, you know. Nowadays in Wellfleet, a piece of land can be $500,000. And building a house, you can't build a house for less than $1.5 million, you know, like to meet all the codes. This is what happens when an art colony becomes gentrified. This is the studio from that house. The outside is plywood. The inside is you know, very, very simple. This is another house by Hayden Walling, and I was saying before, they couldn't get big pieces of glass. So this is a very remote place. They were using only what they could buy at the local lumberyard. So they could get strips of glass, and he would actually overlap the glass like tiles, and that's how you could get the big piece of glass. This is some of those people. This is Jack Phillips, Jack Hall. This is Hasan Özbakan, who is a Turkish economist that started the Club of Rome, and his wife, Anne Özbakan, who is an architect who worked with Mies van der Rohe. And this is Marty Hall, who is married to Jack Hall, who was an artist. So this is sort of them hanging out probably in the late 50s. So at the same time, of course, in Germany, you had the Bauhaus, ended in 1933, and all of these, the Bauhaus started in 2019, right? I mean, 1919 to 33. So a very short period of time. The youngest student there was Marcel Breuer. He came from provincial Hungary, and became the master of the furniture shop, really invented tubular steel furniture. And his most famous chair, the Cheska chair, which you can find these in a gas station in Bangladesh. This is the most reproduced chair in history. And his son says he doesn't get any money from it. There's no royalties, even from Knoll, who was the official manufacturer. So it's tough. But Breuer's philosophy was always this duality. There's the machine-made part, which is the structure, which is the high tech, and then there's the part that your body touches, which is always a natural material, and it's always handmade. And there's always this duality. He was always into these combining opposites. In Mies's furniture, you can't see the connections. In Breuer's furniture, you see every connection, and you see how everything is put together. There's been a lot of good research lately about women at the Bauhaus, and women were actually doing all kinds of stuff. But a lot of that was lost and not known. But this is a woman in the furniture shop. And there were all these women photographers, and this work has really only come to light in the last few years. This is, it's not Goethe Stoltz, it's Mariana Brandt. And a lot of this work has been exposed by Elizabeth Otto here. Excuse me. And she was the curator of our artist residency last year. So in the fall, we have an artist residency with artists and scholars who come and stay in the houses and use the archival material that we have. So we have a lot of archival material from Marcel Breuer from the Chermayeff House, which has never been archived and has not really been seen. So they were really going crazy with all that material. So she's American, then we had a German, Brazilian, and Hungarian, and they were able to go through all the books and read all the Hungarian and German transcriptions. It was really interesting. We're going to have this group back in 2 years to continue that. So of course, the Bauhaus was closed in '33, and most of that group, Breuer, Gropius, Moholy-Nagy, Zanti, Stravinsky, they had all left, mostly gone to London. And then in '37, Gropius is hired by Harvard to take over the School of Architecture and create the GSD, Graduate School of Design, which is architecture, landscape, urban planning. And he basically brings the Bauhaus, a watered-down version of the Bauhaus, to Harvard. The first summer of '37, they spend on Cape Cod. So this is them in that summer at the base of Cape Cod. This is Breuer, Gropius, Santi Stravinsky, and Herbert Bayer and Mary Barnes, and they are redoing the Poseidon and his sons wrestling the sea serpent, right? So the first of the Europeans that came to Wellfleet was Serge Chermayeff. He was Russian, actually Chechnyan. He was educated in the UK. He spent some time in Argentina and became a tango champion, and and then came to the US and was taught at Harvard and Yale, and he was the dean at Brooklyn College. His wife Barbara, who is British, Ivan Chermayeff, and Peter Chermayeff. So the reason why Chermayeff came to Wellfleet was Peter Harnden. So Peter Harnden met Chermayeff, and he also somehow met Jack Phillips. And he introduced the two. And so he got Chermayeff to come to Wellfleet and buy land from Jack Phillips. And this is how the Europeans started coming to Wellfleet. I mean, they might have made it there anyway, but this is one of these mysterious connections. So Ivan Chermayeff had a house in Cadaqués, which is amazing. I just was able to look in the windows. And Peter was an architect. Ivan was very famous graphic designer. He designed most of the great corporate logos of the 50s, 60s. So Peter Harnden there in Bombelli, of course. Harnden is one of those mysterious characters who seems to be everywhere. And so Chermayeff buys an old hunting shack, and he starts changing it, and then he starts building these little studio buildings. I better speed up. Again, I would say a light frame and a light skin. You know, these are almost like, and this building was extended, it was added onto, so they're almost like, very, very flexible buildings. There are 8 of these in Wellfleet of different sizes. And then in 1945, so by 1945, that's Chermayeff in the middle, you have Bernard Rudovsky and Gyuri Kepes, a Hungarian artist and photographer. And they're hanging out, they're making books together, they're designing buildings, they're thinking about courses to teach, so that it becomes a kind of think tank, you know. Rudovsky writes Architecture Without Architects, which really becomes a when I was in school, very, very important book on the connection between modern and vernacular. He also did a villa in Malaga with Coderch, right? Yeah, and I've never seen it. I don't. But he's obviously using this Mediterranean vocabulary, and you know, he's walking the walk. I had an opportunity this last week to stay in Cadaqués for a whole week in this beautiful house by Coderch and Milà, the Villa Javier, it's known as now. You can rent it on Airbnb. And it is truly fantastic. Old fisherman's house. And, you know, they did, Coderch and Milà did these sort of interventions. A lot of the building is original, but these really interesting interventions, like enclosing the stairway, and there's, you know, this hearth, but so much of the building is original. I have to say, this hearth works perfectly. You can have a fire there, it warms up the whole room, and this olive wood is amazing. It burns so easily and so evenly, and I'm used to these fireplaces not being functional. You know, the wind blows them around, but this it works perfectly. So by the mid-40s, you have Gropius, Santi Shavinsky, and one of his students in Wellfleet. Breuer designs his first prototype house, which is called the Longhouse, which he designs for Wellfleet, specifically for this situation. The first version had an open, suspended porch. This is the A part, the original part, and then there was a B part, and then there was a C part often. So there are 4 of these in Wellfleet. This is the Wise House, which is another version. This is Breuer's own house, and this is put way up on a hill. He said that these houses were like a camera on a tripod, that you want to get to exactly the right spot, and that's where the porch was. And they spent all day on the porch. They ate all their meals there. And he designed this kind of brutalist wooden furniture, which is only in this house. Also just cement blocks. You know, and he designed the rug. He and his wife designed and had these rugs made in Morocco. So this is sort of the next big project for the trust. This is Breuer's house. So the son wants to sell it. This is not in the park. So the other houses we have only leased and rented from the park. This we would own. I think it's coming down to 2 million. So we would have to raise that, and the town would pay for the restoration. And Breuer is actually buried. His ashes are buried in the front yard. It has all of his books, his art, his furniture. It's really a museum, or a museum. Some of the art in the house is amazing, and it includes this Miro that's about this big. So Breuer commissioned Miro to do the mural in the UNESCO building in Paris. And this was a test for approval. Miro gave it to Breuer to approve for the design. And there's Paul Klee and Alexander Calder. There's all of these great paintings. This is Santi Shavinsky This is probably in the 60s on Breuer's porch. This is Connie Breuer, Breuer's wife. And this woman here, I couldn't identify for a long time. And then I found her in New York City. She worked in Breuer's office. Her name was Christina Bevington. She is French Senegalese, and I think one of the only women of color who was a registered architect in the early 60s. She just died last year, unfortunately, but there's another Breuer house on the Cape Cod, which was also lost, and I found this with the help of a reporter, and it had all the original furniture. This was a high-budget Breuer house with radiant heating and all the, nice materials. The other ones really are like cabins, but this one really, I figured this house was demolished because nobody knew where it was, and I got a reporter interested, and she searched the records, the town records, and found it. We have very bad historical preservation laws in the U.S., and this Breuer house was demolished last year by the family next door. They bought it, and they tore it down, and they put a tennis court there. So, also in Wellfleet, Paul Weidlinger, Hungarian, very important structural engineer. He built a house in 1953. He came to visit Breuer because he was one of Breuer's main engineers. There's a lot of Hungarians. There's a whole group of Hungarians here. So the park was empty for 20 years, and the park was very close to demolishing it. And we got a lease, and it was a little hard to imagine this house, the way it should be. But anyway, here's a plan. He worked in Corbusier's office in Paris, and he worked for Moholy-Nagy in London. And there's a few Corbusier ideas in this one, like this ramp. And so this is it finished. So these houses we have to furnish, we have to find the furniture and the artwork and everything, And a very large sliding door, which was donated by this Austrian company. Other architects that were there, Charlie Zender, who did these concrete houses. He did these poured concrete because in the 1970s, this was the cheapest way to build a house. So he connected with a company that did parking garages, and he would do these monopore uninsulated towers. He also never studied architecture. He went to art school and did these very nice drawings, but he met Frank Lloyd Wright when he was a student. And this is the house that I grew up in Summers, which he designed, built in '67. So the first house we restored is by Charlie Zender. This is the Kugel Gips house. You can see the Frank Lloyd Wright influence. And this is the other side of it. He's a very interesting architect and never published. He did 53 houses on the Cape, so a big chunk of houses. And he was just doing his own thing. Pretty much nobody knew what he was doing. This is during the restoration. So just a side story here about Sert. So Sert came to Boston, and when Gropius retired in 1953, he takes over Harvard's architecture school. And he did a lot of very big, important, and very good buildings in Boston, including this one, which is Peabody Terrace, which is the married student housing for Harvard. He did the science building at Harvard. He did a lot of really good buildings, mostly a lot of them for academic institutions. And he, of course, was very close with Corbusier, and he got Corbu the only commission he had in North America, which is the Carpenter Center at Harvard. So Corbu, one of Corbu's last buildings, Corbu comes to Boston. He goes into Cert's office, and he's trying to find somebody, a young, impressionable architect, to be in charge of doing the working drawings and the managing construction. And because Corbu went back to Paris, I think he came when it was finished, but to get you had to write him a letter, and like 2 weeks later he would write you a letter back with a little sketch. And I've seen the drawings that he came with, and they were watercolors. They were paintings. There was no mechanical, there was no structural, there was nothing. So this guy, Paul, the young architect, Paul Kruger was selected by, I think he was 27 years old, selected to supervise construction. And right after that, he built this house in Truro, which was based on the apartments in the Unité de Habitation. So it's 3 stories tall, and it's 3 meters wide. And then Cert built this house in Cambridge, which is a square courtyard house based on the Golden Section. And this is a beautiful house, and I know the person that owns it. Nivola did the paving, and he did a big mural in the back. And so a lot of Cert students did versions of this house in New England. This is the Flansburgh House in Lincoln, and you can't see the plan, but it's a square courtyard house with a lot of the same details, the window details and the skylights. This is on Martha's Vineyard Island. This is the Stein House, which is another Cert student. The Isaacson House in Lewiston, Maine, which is almost an exact copy. And another connection was Costantino Nivola. So he, Sardinian artist who was close with Cert and Corbu, and came to Wellfleet and did a lot of work, and was very close with Chermayeff and Breuer. And this is a sculpture in Milan in a Olivetti showroom. So he taught Corbu to do these relief sculptures in wet sand. So you make the impression in wet sand, and then you pour plaster or cement into it, And this is Nivola's children and Corbu in Long Island at Nivola's house. So this is Nivola's house, which was an old farmhouse that he, again, did his kind of modernist intervention. And Corbu did this huge mural on the wall. And Bernard Rudovsky did the entire garden with all these amazing solarium and many other things. And then Peter Chermayeff designed Nivola's museum in Sardinia in his hometown. So this is the Nivola Museum. Other people that were in Wellfleet was Eero Saarinen and his whole family, and Florence Knoll. Saarinen divorced his wife and then stopped coming to Wellfleet, but there is a Saarinen house there. And then Florence Knoll never built a house, but she often stayed. She, of course, was a great furniture designer and also responsible for the mass production of all of the architect-designed furniture of that era. Konrad Wachsmann, who is kind of the father of the space frame, he and Gropius had a company together making prefabricated houses. One of his drawings. Saul Steinberg, the Romanian cartoonist who studied architecture in Milan and then became kind of like the most famous American cartoonist. So this is this famous cartoon explaining how New Yorkers feel about the rest of the world, you know. Alvar Aalto came in 1945 when he was teaching at MIT. So there's a drawing called Cape Cod Hurricane. So basically we do tours, we do conferences. This is a conference we had at the Chermayeff House. We do the artist residency, and the year before last was all Wampanoag artists, and this was the curator who is a Wampanoag tribal leader in front of the Chermayeff House, and some of the artists here from that residency. The book is mostly the reservoir of all of the research. And then the last house that we did was the Kohlberg House, which was also empty for 20 years, was almost on the edge of falling over. And but I couldn't turn down the location. The location is incredible, and the park never asks us to take these houses over until they're right on the edge of being impossible. That's it. Thank you. Did we get like 90% of that? 80%? 90%? Okay. All right. Do you have any questions or?
Just want to say thank you. It's really nice. Since I'm a student, architect student, second year, and I wanted to ask you about, while you were restoring these houses, what type of challenges and struggles did you find, since they were built with wood and they were really old? What type of challenges, like humidity and stuff, I can imagine, but when it comes to that, how do you solve these issues while restoring houses?
Yeah. Well, some of it was the original material, so the flat roofs. It's actually, there's a picture of the hatch house, which the roof was actually, I think the original roof was canvas, painted white, like sometimes ships, I think they would do on ships. But some of the flat roofs are tar and gravel, like stone and tar, and these just, at a certain point, they fail. So now we have rubber roofs, which are really good. I'm always trying to hide insulation, and we have to follow the rules of the Massachusetts Historic Commission. So you have to replace the material with the original whenever it's possible, and you cannot do anything that can't be removed later. So you can't use spray insulation. This house is, the hatch house is completely uninsulated and completely unheated, and that's the way it is, you know. So this house actually is interesting in that it survived very well because water just passes through it. You know, it doesn't provide any real resistance to nature. It's like the kung fu, you know, sort of, you know, you let the energy go by. And then some of them have materials that aren't made anymore. So the Weidlinger house is covered with this plywood that they stopped making in the 70s. So I had to go and find actually a restaurant that had it as an interior material, and I made a deal with them they let us take it, and we paid to have it plastered, you know. So I had to go off into old salvage yards and find an appropriate bathtub or sink, or, you know, I mean, so it's funny talking about these medieval buildings, because this is the recent history, you know, this is the 1960s or 50s, so a lot of this stuff is still around. You can find it, you know. That giant sliding glass door in the Weidlinger house was a single pane, custom-made steel door which was broken and rusted shut. So the new door is a triple glazed lift slide Austrian, $40,000 door. And but it's the right color. We did the paint research to the original colors, which was this bright blue. It's a process, and again, you're as with the houses in Cadaqués, it's like, how do you do a tasteful and thoughtful intervention to make something work better that's in the spirit of the original building, And that's all about this thing of what is patina, what is damage. You keep the patina and you fix the damage, There's actually a beautiful thing written by the man who restored the Maison de Verre by Pierre Chareau in Paris. He wrote a whole thing about the restoration of that, which was really good. Have you read that? Yeah, about all the decisions about, the hand marks on the wall and the wear on the steps, and yeah. It takes a lot of, there's no like simple answers. You have to yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Hassan, do you have any questions?
I'm impressed.
Yeah.
Your lecture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that it will be possible to keep the fort that you have restored
Mm-hmm.
until now, that will be kept properly? This way they are property of the park, are they?
Yes. Yeah.
And are rented.
We have long-term leases, so we usually can only get a 10-year lease, and we're right now renewing 2 of the leases for another 10 years. So it's a very successful from the point of view of the park. It solved a problem for them because these houses are now on the National Register and protected, and they have no expertise to do it, and they have no function for it. They're in the nature business, not in the building business. And so this is a very successful program from their point of view. So there would be no reason to discontinue, but it's also very challenging sometimes. It's the federal government and their priorities change, and yeah. Which is why if we got the Marcel Breuer house, that would be a big change, because it would also be, worth a lot of money. And so right now we don't really own anything except the furniture and the art and the contents, and yeah. But we have a very, very strong base of supporters who are mostly the renters, and we have people who are very fanatically, supportive of it. Yeah.
Maybe the single name of Marcel Breuer can increase this universe when it's finished.
Maybe.
It's the best known worldwide.
Yes. Yes, they just took a building by him in New Haven next to Yale and turned it into the Hotel Marcel. It was a Pirelli rubber building, and they've turned it into an eco hotel that's completely zero energy use, and yeah. So he's cool now. Anybody else? Any questions? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.